Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate it. It's great to be here with everybody. Some familiar faces, some folks who are new for me anyway. So thanks for being here. So this is our chance to talk about philosophy of science, and I've got some places that we could take this. But honestly, as I understand it, the part of the virtue and the sort of like the uniqueness, the distinctiveness of these events is that we can take it in whatever direction people like. So let me set the stage just a little bit. But by all means, like if you've brought something here with you tonight, please share it with us, and it might be something that people have an interesting perspective on. So philosophy of science can take us in many directions. We could think philosophically about the content of science, as people do, right? So we're really thinking about like specific scientific concepts, trying to make sense of them, think of like what they really mean for ourselves and for our world. Thinking about like the content of particular scientific theories, thinking about some of the presuppositions about human beings, about other animals, about the nature of reality that like a particular approach to science might take. So maybe like you just really want to talk about space time, like what is it other than mashing two familiar words together, right? And that's a philosophical question, right? Maybe you like are interested in what differentiates species, and if we should think about species as like genuinely different things, or is this just sort of like a helpful like heuristic for making sense of the world? Maybe you're interested in like biodiversity, and you're like, does the very concept of biodiversity kind of presume that it's a good thing? Is it sort of like built in there? So one of the things that philosophy of science can do is like we can go deep on like specific bits or like quite large elements of the content of science, right? But then maybe you find yourself just as interested in thinking philosophically about the practice of science, like about how science works, and if there's anything like general to be said about that. So maybe you want to think about the role that reasoning plays in science. Is it like an extension of what we're doing in our uh, other parts of our lives? Is it special in some kind of way? Maybe you want to really investigate experimentation, right? The relationship between the things that experiments tell us and the theories that we use, right? Maybe you're actually like interested in the relationship between theory and evidence. Like, how does evidence like actually support a theory? A lot of this might be familiar if you had a chance to maybe take a philosophy of science class, because in part, these kinds of like focuses on like what is the scientific method, like what does reasoning look like in science, was really kind of a central feature of philosophy of science, particularly in the mid 20th century. And we can take that in a lot of different directions. Some folks get to the conclusion that there really is no scientific method. Maybe there are some different methods that you use for different projects. Um, One question that people have been interested historically, and it comes back around again and again, is what makes science different from other enterprises? And maybe philosophy can help answer that question. Like, what makes science different from non-science? What makes science different from nonsense? And maybe those two things are not quite the same either. And so those are sort of at this point pretty classic philosophical questions about science that also were uprooted a bit in sort of the last couple decades of the 20th century, when there was more of an more emphasis on the study of science by non-philosophers, right? Sometimes this is called the social studies of science. So sociologists like really turning their attention to scientists, anthropologists turning their attention to scientists and saying, like, what if we took this tribe, so to speak, what if we took this culture, so to speak, as like an object of study, just like we do other human enterprises? And that kind of turn, the sociology of science, history of science, sort of a social studies of science, that turn was really interesting and really challenging for philosophy. because in some ways philosophy sort of had a chance to like engage with these other people who are interested in thinking critically about science. But then also there was a sense in which philosophy became kind of conservative and like, hey, don't talk about my friend science that way. Like it seems like you're taking science down a peg, and I'm not sure that I particularly like that. Also, particularly when science studies started in the 70s and 80s, there was a much stronger emphasis on a kind of relativism, on a kind of methodological relativism. Like as a good anthropologist, I can't take a stance on like the beliefs of the people I'm studying, and I'm going to hold it. I'm going to hold as closely to that when I'm studying physicists as when I'm studying a group of indigenous people, for example. And that kind of like methodological relativism really rubbed a lot of philosophers of science the wrong way. One of the outcomes of this kind of like for Jean was that philosophers of science are definitely a lot more alive to scientific practice and to like what real scientists actually do, like for better or worse, than maybe we were 100 years ago. Sometimes this is called the naturalistic turn in philosophy of science. So that like if you're really interested in high energy physics, then you really got to know what the high energy physicists are up to. And if you want to ask those questions I was asking about biodiversity, then like you really got to study some ecology, right? Like you can't just like theorize about it from your apartment's top floor where I am. Like you need to get in there and like know the science. And so it's been really interesting in the last, say, 20 years or so to see how there's more of an engagement with philosophers of science, with other scholars as well, but with scientists themselves. So we can take this conversation in like any of those different directions depending on what interests you. But for tonight, I asked you all, or maybe I suggested that you might take a look at a recent essay written by a philosopher of science named Heather Douglas. And Douglas is interested in the social relationships in science, but not just internal to science, not just the relationships of scientists to each other, but the relationships of scientists to the public and publics, like with a plural S on the end of that. Because maybe those of us who aren't scientists aren't all quite the same either. Right. And so Douglas is taking up sort of this question of how do we trust science if we ourselves are not scientists? Now, incidentally, even if you are a scientist, that's still a really interesting and important question. How do you trust your colleagues? How do you trust the people who work in the lab down the hall or the people whose work was published in a journal that you're heavily reliant on? Um, how do you trust those people? But Douglas is interested in how do we trust and how can science be trustworthy, particularly when this is not your field, particularly when you're not an expert in the subject matter that we're talking about. And that kind of question, right? Like, how can you trust responsibly? And on the other side, how can you be trustworthy when there's real epistemic inequality between the parties involved, right? Where we're not equals, not on this subject matter, right? Now, even though I'm a non-expert on this issue, if the tables are turned and you come into my house, I might become an expert on something else. So it's not like the world is divided up into two camps, the people who know things and the people who don't. We all have our knowledge, but real epistemic inequality when it comes to our relationships to these domains of expertise. And philosophically, we can tackle that question in like more or less skeptical ways, right? So like the one very attractive answer to this question might be like, you really can't. Like you're just sort of fooling yourself to think that you can make any informed judgments here. You're quite vulnerable and you just need to like accept that. But maybe there's a balance, right? Maybe we do need to accept our vulnerability while also kind of recognizing some of the ways that we can judge and evaluate trustworthiness. And to flip it around, and Douglas is just as concerned with this, right? Some of the ways that scientists can demonstrate their trustworthiness that isn't just about like, I really know what I'm talking about. You'll have to take my word for it. Now, interestingly, one way to try to kind of cut this knot, right? Just sort of like instead of wading into these thorny issues of like how can you trust across differences of expertise, one way to try to cut that knot is to appeal to the idea of scientific consensus, right? And there might be something really attractive about saying like what you do is you wait for scientific consensus to form, and that's when you know that your trust is justified, right? You yourself are not a participant in these debates, and don't fool yourself into thinking that you are. But when consensus forms, that's evidence. That's evidence that trust would be appropriate, right? And interestingly, Douglas wants to push back on that, right? She thinks that it's probably a mistake to put too much emphasis on consensus. And I'm interested in what you all think about this. If you think maybe she's a little bit too dismissive or she's dismissing too quickly. Part of her concern here is looking at the historical record that consensus can be wrong, has been wrong, right? But she's also worried that if we put and when we put a really strong emphasis on the presence or absence of consensus, that this can be weaponized, right? And that this can create real incentive structures for people to like manufacture dissent, right? For people to be able to make it seem like consensus hasn't formed because if we can manufacture some doubt, then people will withhold trust. This is the kind of thing that Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway talk about in their book Merchants of Doubt, talking about ways in which like the tobacco industry and the energy industry sort of historically has manufactured doubt, in part because there is such an emphasis placed on, well, if there's a consensus, then the rest of us can move forward. And if there's not, then we have to refrain. So Douglas's suggestion is let's not put all of our eggs in that basket. Let's think about some other ways that scientists can be trustworthy, right? So she's talking about trust, but she's also talking about trustworthiness. And so I'm interested to know what you all think about this. She sort of sees it as kind of like a three-pronged approach, right? So one is that the scientist as an expert is able to demonstrate their expertise in some kind of a way. Maybe they're able to point to their track record of incredible success that even those of us on the outside are able to appreciate the weight of. But not always. That's not always going to happen. So she suggests maybe what they're able to do is to be able to explain themselves. They're able to give an account. They're able to sort of like translate their expertise to those outside of the field. That might be a way of demonstrating one's expertise. But this isn't enough, right? Because everything I just said is relatively individualized. And for Douglas, it's going to be really important that a trustworthy scientist is trustworthy in part because of the way that they're engaged with a diverse community of fellow experts, right? So Douglas does not have in mind like a hermit or like a beautiful mad lone genius who's just operating off on her own. This scientist, if they're trustworthy, has a community of fellow experts, of fellow scientists that they're engaging with. And for Douglas, it's really important that this is a diverse community, one in which one in which the give and take of criticism is like a core value. And if we have those two things, she says this is going to go a long way towards scientists being trustworthy. But that's not all, right? So in addition to all of that, she thinks it's also going to be really important that scientists share some of the values of the larger public. And I'm really interested in what you all think about this. It's not as though the scientists just have to defer to the values that are held by the larger community or what happen to be the most dominant values in a society. It's not as straightforward as that. but she does seem to think there needs to be some overlap because this is part of how scientists are worthy of our trust, is that we have some of the same values. Now, these values might include things like how much risk are we willing to put up with, right? How much evidence do we need before we move forward? And the values might also include things like how much do we care about people not going hungry, right? And how much do we care about children being able to be educated? So the kind of values that she has in mind are going to be quite diverse. Some of which are going to be shared, but not necessarily all of them. So as I've been talking about this, I'm sort of fascinated about how you all see yourself in relation to this question. So like, do you think of yourself in like relations of dependency and relations of like trust with scientists and with scientific institutions? Does that seem like it maybe mischaracterizes like how you see yourself in relation to scientists? And if you do think about yourself in like a relationship of trust, is this like fairly impersonal? Is it sort of like an objective thing? Or is it more interpersonal? Is it more relational? Is it more about who you are in particular and the things that you care about and the particular scientists that either do or don't deserve your trust? So I think that's what I wanted to say to set things up. So you might ask yourself about some of those questions that I posed about consensus, about how you see yourself in relation to science. But we can also take this in other directions as well.